Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my December wrap-up for all the books that I read in December. I read 10 books in that month, and I meant to do this wrap-up a lot earlier in the month of January, but just didn't get to it. And I'm rethinking the whole concept of monthly wrap-ups for me. I just feel all this pressure to do this big chunk of reviews all at once, and I think I need to break it up into smaller chunks and go back to a recent reads type video or some other format for talking to you about the books that I have read. But I'm still pondering that, so I will let you know once I know. But for now, I'm going to wrap up the books I read in December. And the very first book that I'll talk about is one that I read on ebook, and that was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This is like a fantasy novel that's been around quite a bit on BookTube lately. I picked it up because Doris had recommended it. She had read it over on Aldi Books, and I was looking for something really escapist and fun, and it was. It is about a researcher from Cambridge who gets funding to do a research project documenting the fairy groups in a far northern land. And so off she goes to document these different types of fairies in this land that she doesn't speak the language and she doesn't really know anybody there. And adventures ensue as this she's very resourceful young woman, but she's also quite a bit out of her depth. And she has a coworker that shows up that she has been antagonistic towards in the past, and they have to basically team up to try to figure out what's going on with the fairies in this spot. So it was a fun read. I did enjoy myself. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue on with the series. I don't know if I liked it well enough to read the next one, but I did have a good time while reading it. The next book was one of the best books that I read in all of 2024, and I did speak about it in my top 10 books, my top 10 favorites from 2024 from a nonfiction. That is The Light Eaters, How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth by Zoe Schlanger. And this is just fabulous. This book is a science journalist summarizing for you all the latest and greatest research on plant intelligence and plant consciousness and what it means, what consciousness means, and how all of the research and science that we do is so human focused that we often overlook other ways of being in the world. And this book really draws the fine point on that. And I thought it was just really enlightening and really made me think a lot, and I absolutely loved it. The next book is another book that also showed up on my favorites list for fiction this time, and that is With No One Is Witness by Elizabeth George. This is book number, I didn't write it down, I think 13 in the Detective Inspector Linley series, which is a mystery series set in Great Britain, following a character called Detective Linley. And in this particular case, which is a turning point in the whole series, Linley and his team are investigating a potential serial killer, and so it is quite different than the other mysteries in the series, and I loved it. I thought it was immensely readable, really page-turnery. She writes long mysteries, and they're sort of literary in nature, and I really love them, and this one was the best of the series so far, in my opinion. Do not read this one without having read some of the previous books. I don't think you need to read them all, but you need to read at least some of them so you understand all the characters, because all of the main characters have a role to play in this story. Then I finished another book in my presidential reading project, and that is No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, The Home Front in World War II by Doris Kearns Goodwin. I read the FDR biography, which made my top 10 list in 2024, and then I wanted to read more about FDR, and this was the next book that I had on my shelf to read, and it was fantastic. Again, this focuses on Franklin and Eleanor during the war years while he's president during World War II, and it lightly touches on all the major events of those years, but it also looks at it through the lens of their relationship, and they had a very non-traditional marriage, and Eleanor Roosevelt is one of my personal heroes, and she was a very independent woman. She had her own goals and things that she wanted to achieve in the world, and they formed a very formidable team, because basically Eleanor Roosevelt was FDR's eyes and ears in the United States, and in fact in the world, because in the beginning he sent her out around the United States because she could more easily travel all around, and she would meet with all these different people and go to all these different places and then come back and report to him what she found. And in that way, she was able to direct a lot of his governance and his policies, and maybe make him a little bit more progressive than he would have been without her. And then as the war progressed, he sent her to places across the world. She went to Australia on tour. She went all around. She went to England and met with the troops, and she was just amazing. And their relationship, while it broke my heart to see the misunderstandings and the hurtfulness that they each imposed on each other in terms of their emotional relationship and their romantic relationship, but it would just like uplifted me to see the professional and the relationship that they had that had to do with work was just simply amazing. And they both truly valued each other, and they both were very hurt by each other over the course of their relationship. And this book really documents it quite well. So I enjoyed reading that book. And again, it's a chunker, but it reads very well. And I did not get bogged down in it. The next book I read was the next book in the Inspector Lynley mystery series. This is What Came Before He Shot Her by Elizabeth George. And this book is kind of a diversion, I would say. Like, none of the main characters are directly in this book, but it fleshes out the information from the previous book. It gives you a little bit more context and background as to the events that happened in the previous book. I did not like this one nearly as much as I liked the previous one, but I am glad that I read it, because I am the kind of person that's a series completist, and I like to read them in order, and I like to have all the knowledge. I don't want to be left hanging later on in the series and have something get referenced that happened in this book and me not know what it was. I hate that. So I always read my series in order. That's just how I like to do it. So while I did not love this one as much as previous books, I am glad that I read it. The next one is another series book in my continuing efforts to complete the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. This is Wizard in Glass. This is book number 4 in the series. And in this one, the gunslinger basically goes back in his mind and tells the story of what happened to him when he was a young man, when he first became a gunslinger, and the events that took place in those formative years when he was a young gunslinger. And he was a very young gunslinger. He was 14 when he became a gunslinger. And so this entire book, this humongous book, is him telling his backstory. And so it's like a book within a book kind of a thing. And I did not love that for this. I did not love that. I mean, the story itself wasn't bad, although I do think it was overly long. And Stephen King has, on occasion in some of his books, I think, been given too much latitude to simply take his story wherever he thinks it ought to go. And I think this one got quite bloated and had a lot of unnecessary stuff. Like the first half of this, like basically nothing happens. And so it did drag on a bit for me. But it is nice to know Roland's backstory. I will say the other thing that bothered me about this, and this again is another quibble that I have with Stephen King, even though he's one of my favorite authors of all time. He writes about young people's sexuality in a way that I find quite cringy. And in this situation, in this story, there is a lot of early teenage sex. I mean, a lot of early teenage sex in this book with 14 and 15-year-olds. And I don't believe that 14 and 15-year-olds are having this kind of sex, this mature kind of sex. Maybe they are, but in my experience and my knowledge of that age group, like, I'm thinking no. And also, like, ew, I don't want to read about 14 and 15-year-olds having sex. Like, ew, it's just cringy. So take that for what it's worth. I am still glad, again, that I read it, because as I have stated, I have to read all of my series in order to completion, or I feel very frustrated with them. So for that reason, I am glad. I then finished the book that we read for the Book Naturalist Book Club in December, and that was A History of Wild Places by Shea, Ernshaw. And check out my standalone review for this book if you want to know more about it. I did enjoy this sort of psychological thriller. I thought it was quite well done. Then I completed a book that was sent to me by review from the publisher. That is Cull of the Wilde, Killing in the Name of Conservation by Hugh, Warwick. And this was sent to me by Bloomsbury Wildlife to be specific, to see what I thought of it. And I enjoyed this. I thought this was good. I was very interested in the topic of culling species because they are non-native to the particular location that the conservation efforts are taking place in, because that's something that I have to deal with in my own work life. I will say that this author's writing style did not completely resonate with me. It's written in a very conversational style, so it's very accessible that way. But I found it to be disjointed in places, and I would get ripped out of my reading experience by like an awkwardly phrased sentence or two. So that, like, it just didn't gel with me. I think that's just a me thing, not the book thing. But the examples that he's talking about here, I think, are really, really interesting. So, like, the first chapter is about, I'll just put this up here so you can see. There's a chapter about hedgehogs. There's a chapter about squirrels. There's a chapter about raccoons. There's a chapter about pythons, which I thought was really eye-opening. Lots of different things, and it goes on for 10 chapters. These are all focused on places in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, so no American examples in here. So if you're looking, except maybe the python, I think the python little section was in America. But for the most part, this doesn't talk about issues in North America or South America. This is very UK focused, very British Commonwealth focused, I would say, which there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's just interesting. And also talking a lot about mammals, and this does not get into plants at all. So if you're looking for information about attempts to control the spread of invasive plant species, for example, like, this book does not delve into that. But I found the case studies that he's talking about to be super interesting. A lot about knock-on effects that we don't consider. He talks a lot about case studies where a species was introduced to a new place where they weren't native in order to control something else, and then the knock-on effects of that. So like rabbits in Australia, for example, or things that they introduced to try to control rabbits in Australia that didn't go the way that one might think they would. And so that's happened a lot through human history, where we've inadvertently introduced something and then we're like, oh no, that's doing really negative things for the local populations. Now how do we deal with it? We'll introduce this other thing that controls the first thing we introduced in the home country, and then that does something really bad, even more bad than the first thing. So he does a good job of laying that all out. And like I said, your mileage may vary in terms of your connection with his writing style. It may work really well for you. It just happened to not particularly connect with me. So very glad that I read that one. And then I read another one of my favorite books of 2024. I read James by Percival Everett, which, again, I talk about in my top 10 favorite fiction books video, which I just posted a couple days ago. I love this book. This is retelling of Huckleberry Finn from Jim's perspective. And in fact, this is James's story. This is not Huckleberry's story. And so if you would like to see a version of the events that happened in Huckleberry Finn, but from a different perspective, this is great. This also gets into the impacts of slavery and white supremacy and what it's like for a Black man to live in the world in this time period, which was pre-Civil War, and the ways that James had to present himself to the world in order to survive. And it's also about how difficult it was for people in this situation and to be enslaved and to try to keep their family together. Just a beautiful book, really well written, totally engaging, just amazing. Just loved everything about this one. And then lastly, I read another one that I don't have a copy of anymore, is Seen, Rachel Carson by Birdie Willis. And this is, the tagline is Stories of Marginalized Trailblazers. That's the series that this book is produced in. And this is a middle grade graphic biography of Rachel Carson, the famous female scientist from the mid-20th century who warned the world about the impacts of pesticide use and wrote lots of books about marine life, which are beautiful and amazing, and I love her writing. I love this. This was a gift to me from Kim at Middle of the Book March for my birthday. Thank you, Kim, again. It was delightful and totally up my alley. And I loved it so much that I donated it to my daughter's classroom. She teaches grades 3 and 4, and I thought it's perfect for that age level. It was really well done, and I want all the kids to know everything about Rachel Carson. So I donated it to them, and hopefully they will get a lot out of it. Anyway, those are the books that I read in December, 10 books. They were all, for the most part, it was a really great reading month. I had a lot of 5-star reads that made it onto my favorites list for the whole year, which is amazing. I hope you're all doing well and finding some great books to read. I'll talk to you later.